Welcome to the Pre to Post Transplant Podcast, a podcast that brings personal stories from transplant survivors, their families, friends, and loved ones. This is where you will hear challenges and triumphs of everyone involved in this journey. Our guests will offer wisdom, advice, and inspiration on everything you want to know about transplant. My name is Jenny McFarland. I am a transplant survivor, and this is a podcast I wish I had before and immediately following my transplant. Thank you for listening. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Pre to Post Transplant Podcast, where you get to tell your side of the story. This is Jenny McFarland, your host, and I have a great episode today. But first, I just want to remind you all to leave a rating and review on the Apple platform podcast thing. I was looking at them the other day, and I love getting reviews. I love seeing all of y'all's comments, and it just makes me happy that my podcast is, doing something for some people. And I'm just excited whenever I read them. And so for those of you who don't know how to use the Apple platform to leave a review, you can go onto the website and leave a comment or an unofficial review. And also you can reach out to me with a request to be on the show or a question or whatever. So you can visit the website at www.pretoposttx.com, and you can leave the comments or look at all the episodes or whatever. So this is my last episode for 2023. I won't be doing it anymore this year, and hopefully next year I can come out with some great episodes with some great topics. I'm excited for 2024. 2023 was a great year, but I'm glad it's over, and I'm ready to start my new chapter with my new year. And every year is a new chapter, so hopefully 2024 is going to be as good, if not better, than 2023. So I just want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and we'll catch up again next year. So with that, let's go ahead and get on with the episode with my guest, Stuart. He comes on, he talks about his journey with his lung transplant, and we talk about a lot of great things, probably a lot of things that a lot of you can relate to. And it's just a great conversation that we had. So I'm going to stop rambling on, and I'm going to get on with the episode. So please help me welcome my guest, Stuart Miller. Hi, Stuart. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jenny. Pleasure to be here.
Great. So let's start with, first, tell me when you had your transplant, why you had your transplant, and where you had your transplant.
Sure. Happy to do that. So I'm a pretty new post-transplant because my transplant, and I don't get to forget this date, is the 1st of April of 2023. So I'm just barely over 7 months post-transplant.
That's fantastic. Congratulations.
So I had a bilateral orthotic lung transplant, so a double lung transplant, and I had that at Vanderbilt Medical Center. The reason that I needed that is I was diagnosed about 3 years ago with interstitial lung disease. I started having breathlessness, went and had an acute episode, went to ED, and they basically said, "We think you have pneumonia." And they took me in, and I got screened out for a whole bunch of stuff. And then suddenly the pulmonology guys turned up, and it was like, no, you've got something else going on. You've got some inflammation at the edges of your lung. So we want to evaluate for a whole bunch of things. And it was very, very an interesting process because I'm a nurse by training. Okay. I've had spent almost all of my life, my professional life, working in and around healthcare. I now work in healthcare IT in terms of providing technology solutions to healthcare organizations. So I'm very medically literate. And it was very interesting to me that they basically went through and they ruled out everything. They chased everything down. They chased all of the inflammatory, sort of stuff. They chased all of the sort of obvious viral and microbial and just everything. And everything was coming up nothing. There just was there was no smoking gun for where this interstitial lung disease damage had come from. But clearly, it was affecting me, compromising me. So I ended up on oxygen. I managed to get a bit fitter and wean myself off. I wasn't on any particularly aggressive medications beyond prednisone. It wasn't Ofev or any of those kind of weird biologics. And I was relatively stable. And in fact, I actually was doing quite well up through the end of 2022. In fact, my wife and I went on a transatlantic cruise, and I got up every morning. I did an hour walking around the ship whilst it was quiet. And so I got like 3.5 miles in every day. I was doing great. And then in March, at the beginning of March of this year, I suddenly had a quite sharp, precipitous fall, was admitted with pneumonia to our local Vanderbilt facility here in our little town just outside Nashville. And they treated me with antibiotics and prednisone, and then discharged me after 3 days and said, "Oh, you finish the antibiotics at home, you're good to go," etc. And within 3 days, I knew the antibiotics weren't working. And so I ended up having a very sharp decline where my oxygen saturation went from kind of high 80s to 81.
Okay.
And that was on like 10, 11%, 10, 11 liters of oxygen, coming straight out of a tank. And I only had like a kind of tall tank to be able to deal with that, which meant, I was going to run out. And that's when
Yeah.
my son said, "Okay, I'm calling the EMS."
Yeah.
And so they came, scooped me, took me to Vanderbilt. And I thought it's just an exacerbation of the pneumonia. And it turned out, no, it was significantly more serious than that.
Yeah. So what was the actual diagnosis of why you needed a transplant?
So they ended up, my terminal diagnosis before they removed my lungs was idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, which
Okay.
basically means they don't know.
Right.
They
Yeah.
just basically, I had this cascade fibrosis formed in the space of what I guess was a month, whereby I ended up with, effectively 15% viable tissue by the time they made the decision to put me on the transplant list. So we did that around about the 18th of March. And they put me, they said, "We're going, we can't save your lungs. We're going to have to put you in the transplant list." I then had that evaluation, that pre-transplant evaluation that normally takes several weeks for most people, was done in about 5 days.
Yeah.
And they then sort of had their little kind of, medical conflab, in terms of the listing meeting, on the 29th of March and listed me. And I think I was told the next morning, "We think we've identified a set of lungs that are viable tissue for you." Now, that's really interesting timing because, of course, for anybody, and this is inside baseball knowledge, they changed the scoring criteria for lung transplant at the beginning of March. And essentially, I probably wouldn't have gotten this lung tissue that I received from my donor because it came from Phoenix, Arizona. And of course, I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. So I probably wouldn't have had those lungs because prior, any donated tissue typically would go to people within about a 250-mile radius. And of course, they opened up the criteria to make it available to best match, highest needs, scoring, etc. And so my particular donor probably wouldn't have been available to me if we had been doing that in February. But thank God the criteria changed, and I think because of the urgency of my collapse, I mean, I was on enhanced forced oxygen, sort of using the sort of heated and humidified oxygen, and I think I was on 60 liters at 100% an hour, to the extent whereby when I was in ICU, and they would walk me to try and sort of like keep me exercised
Right.
whilst waiting for the process. I could only walk for 15 minutes because they couldn't find an oxygen tank big enough for me to walk around the unit.
Wow.
I was on so much oxygen to use that tiny amount of tissue I still had. But all things were great. The tissue came across. And as I say, at 4:30 on the Saturday morning, April 1st, suddenly all the anesthetics people arrived, the transplant team arrived, the thoracic surgery team arrived, and you've got 15 people around you, sort of unplugging you, plugging you into the sort of mobile things, and off I went down to theatre to receive my lungs.
So let me back up just a little bit. First, did you know that they had changed the criteria before you got called, or were you just surprised and you're like,
No,
well,
I knew. So here's how quickly it all happened. Bearing in mind that I hadn't even contemplated a lung transplant until the 20th of March, when they walked in and said, "I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do.
yeah,
We need to do the transplant list." So I had not done any research at that point, thinking if this was in my future, it was probably many years in my future, and that
yeah,
I would live with this stable interstitial lung disease. And so I, given the kind of person I am, I immediately became, Dr. Google, and
yeah.
started Googling things to try and learn and understand. And
Sometimes that's not a great idea.
I know,
Yeah,
because then, I mean, well,
yeah,
you hear all the scary things that are out
right.
there,
Yeah,
about, sort of survivability and things. And it's one of the things that's really interesting is, though, I've now met so many long-lived transplant survivors that I wish we could go and edit the internet,
yeah,
because things like the average 5-year survivability and things like that. And yes, we all know there are people who don't survive 5 years, and etc., and the averages, etc. But so many people I've met who have
well,
had
that's
only,
not just the internet. I mean, the pre-evaluation doctors and
oh
people
yeah,
who do it, they tell you also, your statistics are 5 years. So
yeah,
when I first heard that, I didn't know any other transplant recipients yet. I hadn't heard about the people who live 20, 30 years past
yeah,
transplant, and so that's just terrifying. And they did tell me that because I had cystic fibrosis, that's why I got
yes,
the transplant. They said that people with CF tend to do better with lung transplant, usually because they get it when they're younger. I was already, almost 40. So I was like, well, that I'm almost 40. But luckily, with the meeting people and in this small community that we have, I was able to learn about people who are living so much longer than 5 years. So I hate that 5 year statistic thing because it really scares the hell out of people, whenever
it
they hear it.
does. And I'll put it in context here for a second. I had a friend who I worked with several years ago reached out to me after seeing my story on LinkedIn, where I posted, what had happened to me. Interestingly, I've had to take that post down because a lot of people, cautioned me about putting that out, and because I still
Yeah.
intend to work in my career as long as I possibly can. And people were saying, just be careful about, advertising. But anyway, Dean had seen my story. He has interstitial lung disease and is actually probably more chronically advanced than I was at the time I had my very acute failure. And he reached out to me, and he was contemplating. In fact, his brother has the same condition. They're twins, and they both have the same condition. And his brother has already said, I'm not going to do it because it's only buying me 5 years. I don't want to do that,
Yeah.
And so I was saying to Dean, you can't approach it on that way. You've got to look at the upside, because there are also people who, in those statistics, if you understand enough math, you understand statistics is just an average. It's not even a
Right.
median. It's just an average. And so therefore, there are people who receive a lung transplant and die within 2-3 months.
Yeah.
And there are other people who survive 24, 25, 30 years. And so you have to look at that at being a balance there. And many of the transplant centers are becoming a lot more aggressive about the patients that they will transplant into. So therefore, there are some patients who are maybe more frail that are not are on that side of the average as opposed to the other side. So I was telling him to like try and take a more balanced view as he looked at those statistics.
You know what I have to say to that is, and of course, every single person is different, but based on my experience, if I only had 5 years, the 5 years that I've had have been better and healthier and more amazing than the previous 15 years. So
Yeah.
even if I only had 5 years, they were 5 very good years rather
Yes.
than another 5 or 10 years of being sick and not being able to do anything. So if somebody had said that to me, I would say, this is my experience. I would rather take these 5 amazing years over another 10 years of being sick and miserable. So that's what I would say to your friend there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then I was also going to ask you, and you talked a little bit about it, is when they told you you needed a transplant, I was just wondering how that news kind of hit you. Because, like you said, you didn't really know about transplants, you didn't know you were going to need one. And so for them to come in and tell you, hey, there's nothing else we can do, you have to have a transplant. I'm always curious how people feel with that news, because for me, I kind of already knew, it's like cystic fibrosis and transplant go together. So you're kind of prepared for it. So I'm always curious how it feels when somebody who has no clue or no idea that they're going to need one, when they get that news.
Yeah. So I'll share with you that. So it was the medical director of medical ICU who then he and his team had been caring for me because I'm lying there, I'm on maximum, sort of oxygen, and sort of been working with them whilst they're trying to sort of treat me. I've had all these IV antibiotics and IV steroids, and he walked in and said, "Mr. Miller, I'm really sorry. We can't save your lungs. We're going to have to list you for transplant." And I think that from him saying that and me going, "Okay, so what does that mean?" And he said, "We'll talk to you a little later, let you digest that, have some breakfast." Because this was morning rounds, 7:20 in the morning. I'd say I can even remember the time.
Wow.
And I think from then, for about 4 or 5 hours, I was just in complete shock. I was just like, I couldn't process the information. And some of that was, you're already lying in an ICU bed connected to everything. You're sort of like, weak already from, sort of the lack of oxygen and being laid in bed from at that point for 3 weeks. And so you're going to sort of like trying to sort of like process it. And then I got to, and this is very typical of my character, and it will become a recurring theme as we talk about my progression forward and then how I look forward. I basically said, pick yourself up. What are we going to do? You've got a problem to solve. So let's solve the problem. Let's try and understand what needs to be done and create a plan. Let's move on. Now, and then I immediately broke into, okay, and now how do I tell my wife? How do I prepare her, help her, be able to sort of make sure she's going to be okay downstream? Need to reach out to my 2 kids, make sure they're able to look after their mom, etc., etc. So I immediately jumped into problem solving mode. And some of that's because I spent most of my professional career in sales. I mean, I think personality wise, I'm a glass half full person anyway, right?
Yeah.
But then when you're in sales, one, you deal with rejection a lot with a small R, not a big R, like we deal with as transplant patients. And you deal with how to overcome objections and how to try and sort of plan your way through different phases of activity. So I jumped into wanting to understand how this whole thing was going to work. And okay, what do I need to do in it? And what do other people need to do in it? And how do we basically create a project plan around this activity that we've got going on now to solve my problem, which is I need to get some new lungs so that I can carry on and thrive.
Yeah. That's a great way to face that problem straight on, It's a great attitude to have.
Yeah, but I mean, I did. I went in the hole for I went in the hole, but it was for like 4 hours.
Yeah.
And then I kicked myself in the backside and said, let's get on.
Yeah.
Let's solve this.
Well, sometimes it takes people a lot longer than 4 hours to get.
Oh yeah.
So okay.
I understand.
So you finally got the call and you get wheeled off to surgery. How did everything go?
So the call was interesting because obviously I was already there in the hospital in the ICU, and basically one of my favorite clinicians, and Dr. K.M. McPherson, came in and said, Stuart, I'm delighted to tell you we got the lungs and we've dispatched a team to go and collect them, from Phoenix, Arizona, and they'll be flying back, etc. And then, as I say, they essentially arrived on Friday evening, Saturday morning, everybody's there. They're, sort of pulling me down to the OR. The next thing I obviously remember is, sort of waking up intubated, on the ventilator as they roused me and brought me up. And I was still obviously physically incapacitated in terms of that they had me sort of like, on enough drugs to have me there, but I was aware. And they had obviously removed the endo tube from me in terms of for breathing, but I still had fluid in my lungs. So I had that weird sensation of like half drowning thing. And yeah, I couldn't really do anything about it. And all I was aware of was my wife yelling at the either the nurse or anesthetist or whoever was bringing me up. Don't you understand? He needs help. You're sort of like blaming him. He's not comfortable. And she could, so my wife could hear me saying, because I could feel bubbles in my bronchies. And they eventually, it was fixed, and then they must have lightened the anesthetic some more, and I came up, and then it was like they kind of sort of elevated me a little bit, and then you start the process of recovering. And I think that from that point, over the next few days, it was then the transition to out of the ICU and into step down, and that happened pretty quickly because I think that I was very fortunate, and I preface this, and I promise my doctors, I would always preface this in telling my story to anyone. I had an extraordinary good return from surgery.
That's fantastic.
I was discharged after 11 days.
Yeah.
I was on room air after 24 hours. So I was only in oxygen for 24 hours post-surgery. And I, again, the reason for that is I approached it as a project plan. I basically went, okay, what do I need to do to get discharged? How do I get out of here? And that was a challenge because they were like, they wanted to send me to inpatient rehab. They wanted me on for 30 days. They wanted to do this. They wanted to do that. And I went, no. I want to go home. I'll travel in every day because I live just outside Nashville. I travel in every day for rehab. I don't care. I said, but no, I want to sleep in my own bed. That's my goal. And so everything was, all right, how do I get the drains out? All right, how do I get the IV out? All right, how do I get, and they had given me pain relief into my spine. And that was one of the big obstacles. And I said, okay, how do we get that out? What do I need to do? What do I need to achieve to get that out? Same with the OT and PT folks who were doing the rehab assessment. that, and then their initial approach was, oh no, you're going over to the inpatient rehab center, from here. And I went, nope, don't want to do that. I want to go home. What do
Was
I need
there
to do
a
to?
was there a reason why they wanted you to go there? Because usually you go there because you're like you don't have good movement or you need rehab. Did you need rehab?
Well, I didn't think I did, but of course, I think so. So one of the things is, and I understand why it is. Being an ex-clinician, I understand why their attitude was the way it was. I think that and it's one of my themes. I originally trained as a psychiatric nurse, as in mental health, and one of the big things that you're taught when you're dealing with anybody that has got mental health challenges of whatever degree and severity is you mustn't label them. They're all individuals. And unfortunately, generally in medicine, they tend to label you. Yeah. Okay. In room 707 is Mr. Miller. He's a 60-year-old white male, bald. So they label you and bracket you as that. They don't look at you as an individual, who your family are, what your life experiences are, and so on and so forth. So I made a very conscious effort with all of my providers, be it the medical staff, be it the PTs, OTs, be it the nursing staff who were caring for me, to tell my story, to get them to see me as a person. Because I think that it's part defense mechanism, in part it's convenient from an institutional process perspective to bracket you with these labels. But the problem with that is they then average you out. They think everybody, you're a 60-year-old man, so therefore you're not going to be as capable as a 40-year-old CF patient.
Yeah.
Well, that wasn't true. I was actually incredibly otherwise well. Other than being a bit obese, I didn't have any other complicating medical problems. And I think that's part of why I had such a great recovery is that. And then also my positive mental attitude, my approach to problem solving. I wanted years ago, that's what I wanted to achieve. How do I remove the obstacles to that goal? And I did that all the way through. But most important was that process of trying to get the medical providers to see you as a person, as an individual, so that they didn't just bracket you as the average and most people need rehab, and therefore, even if it's only 7 days before you're there. So they were trying to negotiate with me, and I was just approached it as a contract negotiation and said, no, I don't like those terms. I'd rather go home. So that became part of my defining the transaction, so to speak, is how do I get it? How do I get the heck out of here?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's good that you were able to see that you didn't need it and see, advocate for yourself and be like, no, this isn't what's going to happening. I will say that there's a fine line. You have to be careful because you don't want your medical team to label you as non-compliant. Yeah.
Yes.
And so I it's hard. Like even for me to this day, like if there's something I don't want to do, I'm always a little bit paranoid that they're going to see me as non-compliant. And if I ever need another transplant, they're going to be like, no, she doesn't follow the rules. So it's just hard. It's a hard thing to do. And it's like some things you just have to be super careful with. But I'm glad that you were able to, make them see that you didn't need it.
Yeah. And I think it is part of that is about trying to approach it in the right spirit and understanding their point of view.
Yeah.
But replying with your point of view at a logical level, not an emotional level. I mean, and I've seen it, and occasionally, and we'll talk about my setback, which happened quite quickly after discharge. You can get to an emotional state whereby you just give an emotional response. But on the whole, with the providers, one, because of my background as a salesperson, I like people to like me, and because people like to buy from people that they like. So therefore, there is some of that in terms of my personality. And I think that helped. But also trying to be very logical about negotiating backwards and forwards. I think that's important, and I totally understand and appreciate that not everybody is going to be capable of that. So if you look at my biological response, that I had a really good biological response. God bless my donor, and I still don't know who my donor is, other than that it was somebody from Phoenix, Arizona, or at least that was from in a facility in Phoenix, Arizona.
Yeah.
But this tissue that I've received has been remarkably responsive to me, because I really have had minimal trouble. The trouble I did have is 10 days after discharge, my home PFT scores went off a cliff. And so, of course, I called and they said, get yourself to here, to the medical center, ED now. So my wife drives me across because, I guess, I'm driving myself because it's post-transplant. And was admitted there, and the imaging showed a pleural effusion on my left lung.
Okay.
And so immediately their assessment was, this is rejection. You've developed fluid because of rejection. Because, of course, you're 20 days post-transplant, so of course it's going to be rejection.
Yeah.
And interestingly, when they drained that, they started to drain to, take the fluid off. And of course, they blasted me with, the high dose IV, right? So methylprednisolone,
Yeah.
and a whole bunch of other stuff. And then they started, flushing some of the other medications in to resolve this, prevent any scarring as that, sort of little chasm started to close up as the fluid was draining off. But by the end of that, and it took about 10 days, I was stir crazy, because unlike when you're in that acute phase, like I was acutely ill before transplant and acutely ill recovering from transplant, when you've got a chest drain in, everybody just ignores you.
Yeah.
And just says, well, you don't really need anything because the drain's doing its thing and we're waiting on the meds to work.
Yeah.
And so you suddenly go from this kind of like high attention person that's got lots and lots going on to stick them in a corner room over there and you'll be quiet, you'll like that. Now, thankfully, I had a beautiful view from one of the higher floors at Vanderbilt. But by day 7, I was, and I guess I was a little depressed, but I was angry. I just didn't want to be there. I felt like I was being ignored. I felt like nobody was updating me. It was just they were waiting. And I was just like done with being in hospital, because I was well enough that I could move around. I could go to the bathroom in my own, driving my various bags and things around with me. I wasn't catheterized. After 2 days, 3 days, I didn't have any IVs in. I was just waiting, and I got very frustrated. And thankfully, the nursing staff who were caring for me were people who had been multiple days. And I actually, when I got grumpy and upset, they were very, very, they were very, very responsive emotionally, and that was good. And I felt guilty afterwards because they hadn't placed me back into the post-surgery unit that deals with transplant patients. They placed me in a general surgery.
So they didn't know as much as they should as the other.
So they didn't know as much about how to care for me as a post-transplant patient. And secondly, they had some really sick people in the unit and were understaffed.
Yeah.
And I actually felt guilty afterwards when I thought about it rationally, in that they were under a lot of stress too, particularly the nursing staff in the unit, because they were trying to deal with a lot of stuff that was going on in the unit. And I was just, I did feel I was being selfish a little bit, getting so frustrated and angry about being in there, when actually they were dealing with people who were at that point were sicker than me. I might have been 21 days post transplant, but there were people who were way worse than me who were actually in that unit at the time.
Yeah, I dealt with that my whole life. I was in and out of the hospital, and it's always worse when you start to feel better because when you're
Yes.
feeling normal in the hospital, it's excruciating just sitting in that little room waiting. And it's hard. I consider myself to be very patient. I know that the other nurses or whoever, techs or doctors, they all have other patients that are usually sicker than me. And so it's hard. It's hard to stay patient. And then, one time I remember getting pretty frustrated because they were ignoring me, just like you said. Like I can relate to everything that you said there. And I told them once, I was like, I understand you have other patients, but I'm a patient too. And sometimes I need a little bit of your attention. And it didn't help, saying that. But like I understand what you're saying by getting frustrated because they're ignoring you because you don't need them. You don't need their care. You're just waiting. But it's just hard because you're waiting and waiting. And so I know what you're saying. And I know that
Yeah.
they know what you're saying. But they're there every day and they don't pay much attention to that. They're just trying to do what they can do in the time that they have. So
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So did it turn out to be actual rejection or was it just fluid?
So eventually, I hadn't, towards the end of that stay, as they were contemplating discharging me, the medical director of the long transplant service, a fantastic guy called David Erasmus at Vanderbilt, I really like him and his style. He's one of those kind of quiet physicians, but incredibly thoughtful. And I've researched a lot on him about his research and his background. And he's, originally born, raised, and trained for his medical degree in South Africa. So we had a lot of that. For anybody who hasn't worked out in the podcast, I'm not a native Tennessean with this accent. I moved here to the States in 2002 with my family from the United Kingdom. But talking with David, he basically said there was nothing that indicated, none of the markers for rejection or in the bronchoscopy that they did that indicated acute rejection. So as far as he's concerned, there were tons of lymphocytes in the fluid. He believes is what, he kind of casually called a lymphocyte dump, that because of the trauma, when they do your sternotomy and crack you open here, it obviously cuts through and disrupts a lot of the lymph nodes that are in your chest. And he thinks that what it was just a dump of lymphocytes from the damaged lymph nodes in the chest. And they had to go somewhere and they just went to this pocket at the bottom, the bottom side of my left lung. And of course, that then created the pressure that created the shortness of breath and so on and so forth. So it's one of those things whereby if I was going to get a pleural effusion, I'd probably have one of the best ones I could. It wasn't blood.
Yeah.
It wasn't because of acute rejection and cell damage. And so therefore, I'll take it. Again, better to be lucky than good sometimes. And he is 100% convinced, because I have been very fortunate in that none of my biopsies from my bronchoscopies have shown any rejection of any kind. So either the CellSept and Tacrol are doing an amazing job, which I'm sure they are, or I have been blessed with a fantastic cellular match, and I'll take that right now. And we all know we roll the dice every day that we could be affected either from an infection initiating some rejection or whatever. But I've been very fortunate so far.
Oh, that's fantastic. I kind of I had the same experience. I did remarkably well. Is that the only setback that you've had?
That's the only one. And as soon as I had got clear of that, the interesting thing is, in between being discharged and that setback, I only got one outpatient rehab session done. which was fantastic because I showed up, with my little walker frame because they said, oh no, no, you're risk of fall, so you need to use a walker if you're going
Mm.
in more than about 3 or 4 feet. So I'm like hauling around this aluminum walker frame, which I didn't really feel I needed, but I used that because I obviously did have some leg wasting and muscle weakness, etc. And the fantastic thing was that when I had my first rehab session, Ashley, who was my PT, she said, "Do you think you can walk without that?" I'm like, "Yeah, okay." And she said, "Okay, do 12 that way, and then just walk back to me." And I did that and got back to her, and she said, "Okay, fold up this walker. You're not using that again."
Yeah.
And I was like ecstatic coming away from that session that she said, put away the walker. Because as far as I was concerned, yeah, walking frame was another indication of you're an old man with white hairs and you've
Yeah.
had a transplant and you're a sick person. And it was just another sign of that. So once I got out after the pleural effusion, I restarted and started number 2 of my 24 inpatient rehab sessions. And I said to her, I said, every session I come to you, I want to crank it up. I either want to walk further, I want to walk on incline, I want to do the steps, and I basically said, make it a challenge. I don't want to just come here and do 24 weeks of let's walk for 30 minutes. I'm not trying and push it up. So by the third week, and I was doing, typically I was doing 3 sessions a week, driving in, do the sessions, attend my other appointments at Vanderbilt, etc. By the time we got to the third week, I was on the weight machines. First legs, to build up more muscle tissue back into my legs and to sort of my abdominal core. That was the thing that I hadn't anticipated. Having laid in bed initially for almost a month and a half for being sick before transplant and recovering
Oh,
after
yeah.
transplant, and then readmitted for those 10 days where you're tied in bed, getting your infusion, you've got a drain, you're hauling that around, so you can't go very far. It was my abdominal core weakness that stunned me. That's why I couldn't do steps. I didn't realize that. At first, I thought it was my leg strength had gone,
Yeah.
but Ashley explained to me, she said, no, it's your core. So about 3 weeks after starting rehab, I was working there. And by week 5, I was doing core activity. I couldn't, I mean, like she tried to get me to do a plank and I couldn't, even on my knees, I couldn't do a plank, but I started doing more and more to try and strengthen the muscles around there. I started walking further. I started walking on inclines. I started using, once they cleared me, they took my staples out and I was cleared to drive, which was like, oh my goodness. If there was ever a victory, being cleared to drive was it, for somebody like me that's pretty independent.
Yeah.
But that then allowed me to start using, upper body machines
Yeah.
in the rehab center. And I think that's when I went, okay, we're going places now. And I started increasing the amount of resistance, which was tiny compared to what I used to be able to do at the gym, but I didn't care. I knew that if I worked at it, I could add, another 5 pounds to
Yeah.
the other plate on the machine to be able to do more. So I really approached it on the basis of climb, keep doing more, trying to do more, take on more, so that by the time I was discharged from inpatient rehab, I really felt significantly more normal. And that's round about month 3 post-transplant, so towards the end
Yeah.
of June.
I really like your attitude. Even, as you're recovering at home, you still have this like super positive attitude. And you're like, what, how can I recover? What can I do to, recover quicker? And a lot of people don't have that attitude at all. Like, I think having, a positive attitude and that kind of, determination to recover really has helped you and probably other people who have the same attitude recover, easier, faster, or, better. So I think that's
Yeah.
great. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So you're only what, 7 months post, you said? Almost 8?
Absolutely. But we missed the landmark
Oh,
because
let's talk about it.
on 6 weeks ago now. So just at the end of month 5, approaching month 6, I'd set myself another goal. There's a charity event here in our little town outside Nashville, and I live in Lebanon, Tennessee. And they have a cancer charity event every year called Sherry's Run. It's a 5K. And it's a very well attended community event. I mean, it's a couple of thousand participants.
Wow.
And I said, you know what? I know I can do 3 miles on the treadmill. So 5K, I can do that. I don't know about outside because with it being the middle of the summer here in Tennessee, I wasn't really walking outside very much because it's too darn hot and too much humidity. But by the time we got to September, I was like, okay, let's do Sherry's Run. It's at 8 a.m. in the morning. The temperature's not going to be too crazy. And so I applied for, in June, I applied for it, and I even paid the extra $10 to get a check, to get a timer on it. And it wasn't because I was going to be one of those super athletes at the front there, but I just wanted an official record of whatever my time was. And I knew I could do 3.2, 3.3 miles on the treadmill with a bit of up and down the incline in about an hour and 10 minutes. Because I can only walk at 3 mile an hour, 3.3 mile an hour pace. So an hour and 10 was kind of mentally where I had set my challenge, is if I could complete this walk in that time, that would be fantastic. So I showed up. My wife was out of town because she was looking after her granddaughter for my daughter down in Atlanta. And I showed up. I was masked up. I was blooped up with all my sun cream and everything.
Yeah.
I'm a big white brown hat on. And of course, because I was there on my own, I mean, people are looking at me going, who's the guy walking around in a mask? But it didn't matter. I got there. I walked through steady pace, and I came in 53 minutes. I was ecstatic.
Wow, that's great.
And it was such a huge landmark to be able to do that in a relatively public way, and to be able to say I did it. And there's video of me crossing the finish line because they had all the equipment and they do all that kind of thing. And I just was so ecstatically happy that I was able to achieve that. And then after that, it's the 6-month eval in Bronx, and I passed that with flying colors. So I think that everything so far, my PFTs have continued to be at or better than previous ones. So I've either had a couple of months of plateauing, but on the whole, my PFTs have been really good. So I'm very, very happy. And again, they keep warning me, you're up above the 95th percentile of experience in terms of how well it's gone for you. Don't assume all patients have had that.
Yeah.
But I feel it's important to communicate out to everybody. It can happen. And a large part of it is, I think, yes, you have to be blessed with hopefully a good cellular match in terms of your genetic tissue. But then it's down to you. You need to sort of decide that you don't want to be the sick person. Yes, we know we're always going to be immunodeficient and compromised. Yes, we know that we're going to be dependent on some of these medications, and we are going to need help from time to time as we suffer setbacks. But you just don't give in to being a sick person. I think that's the main thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with it. Like, don't give in to it. You got to keep going. I say that all the time. Yeah. That's fantastic. That's great that you were able to do that. It's always nice to hear people's achievements or like accomplishments after transplant, or they're able to do something that they couldn't do. I had a few of those, and it's always those things that are really the most important. Like they're the things that matter the most, that you're able to do these things now. I think it's fantastic. That's great. Congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And of course, now moving on to sort of like the next phase of living.
Yeah.
I returned to working for my employer remotely. So I'm fortunate to have a job whereby I can apply a lot of my skills without having to, either get in a car or an airplane and travel to work. I can do a lot of my work remotely. I always have been a remote worker.
I know.
For
I know a lot
last
of people are going to wonder what that is, if you don't mind sharing.
So I still am involved in the sales organization of the company that I work for that provides technology solutions to hospitals. And I manage salespeople and basically provide enablement. It all sounds a bit irritating. Basically, I help provide training and support resources and coaching for salespeople to be successful in what they're doing. So that's what I do for my employer now. Before that, before my transplant, I directly managed a team of salespeople. But my employer was very gracious in creating a role that allowed me to be able to use my knowledge, skills, and experience in a different way to help support all of the sales teams in our organization without having to have the stress and pressure of having, a team quota and weekly reporting of numbers and all of those kind of things.
Right.
So they've been excellent in terms of accepting that. It was a little, I think they were a little concerned at first because, again, my providers, my employer wanted an AEA declaration from my clinicians to say that, what my degree of fitness for work was and what my degree of disability was. And I think the first draft that was sent by Vanderbilt to my employer didn't pass through me, so I didn't get to see what they'd written. But what went through scared them to death in terms of it made me sound like a very sick and compromised person. And I didn't feel that at all. I was ready to get stuck back in and felt that I was mentally competent and capable of doing 8 hours a day and so on and so forth. But the way that the language was phrased in the disability statement was basically, it's that classic thing of medical professionals will always give you the kind of worst pessimistic statement of what things could happen. And so therefore it made it very scary, I think, for in particular the HR folks at my employer. So it took a few weeks of negotiating that down to something more reasonable for my employer to get comfortable with, okay, Stuart's good to come back and we're not going to be a contributing factor to making him more sick or worse, creating conditions that might damage him. And since then, I've, had no issues at all. I've been able to, focus. Occasionally, I will find, is this because of the drugs? Is this because of tiredness? Because I'm still recovering? The biggest challenge I have now is, particularly as the weather temperature has changed. And I don't know how much this is an experience for other people. I found that my incision area around my chest is tighter now in the winter. So I don't know if that's a cold thing or what. So I do a lot of breathing exercises to open up my chest and try and sort of do that. And certainly there's nothing going on in the x-rays that would indicate there's anything, nefarious going on with my sternal fixation or anything like that. But I found that the change in temperature has affected that. And sometimes, and that means that I feel a little more tired in the afternoons. But I then just get up early and do, catch up on that work in the morning and sort of, I'm able to progress on.
I hadn't heard that weather changes. I I experienced the tightness in the incision, but it was, like a constant thing for the first several months after.
Mm.
I hadn't heard the cold thing, although, I lived in Houston. It didn't really get that cold. Um,
Yeah.
so I couldn't tell from my experience. I haven't really heard anything
Yeah.
about that. And that's interesting that you say that.
Well, it's one of those other things that, and you're still blessed with yeah, elements of youth, is that that older people also just it's back to that thing of they feel the cold,
Yeah.
which is kind of ironic that I'm now contemplating moving from Tennessee to Minnesota, but that's okay.
Yeah. That's going to be a pretty big change there.
Yeah,
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about that because it's actually how we kind of started our conversation way back on Facebook. You
yeah,
were thinking about moving to another town. Have
yeah.
you talked with your team about that? How do they feel about it?
So I found out in terms of general terms, and of course you get the because I'm inside the kind of 12 month window, the first
Yeah,
year window, you
yeah,
get the very cautious response, and you need to sort of maintain your connection here, etc. And I said, yeah, that's fine. Guess what? There are planes that fly from Minneapolis to Nashville direct, so that's not a problem. I can overcome that challenge. Um, I think that they are, now that it's becoming very real because we now have a buyer for our house. And so therefore, we're probably going to spend Christmas homeless whilst we're in the process of buying another home up there. But that's okay because we have plans as to how to deal with that.
yeah,
So I'm pretty sure I know how we're going to deal with it, which is at the minute because I've had such good progress. I'm monthly appointments. I had my 6 month bronch and it was clear, and they said you're good until 12 months, so I don't need a 9 month bronch. But even if I did, then that's what, a couple of nights, because you night pre, night post, and you're probably good to get back to wherever you need to be. And so my aim is that I will move there. And I'm going to be very fortunate because I'll be near another very large transplant center.
yeah,
And I will continue my care with Vanderbilt through the 1 year anniversary, and then I will look to transition.
yeah,
And I think that's where I've become very interested in your story, and I know you made the move. Maybe you didn't. I don't think you did in your first year,
no,
but that transition from one set of providers who were there with you from the beginning to another set of providers, and I said you commuted for your care for some time, if I remember your story.
yeah. So I moved last year around this time. I was 4 years out, so I lived in Houston for my first 4 years. I'm from Albuquerque. I moved to Houston for the transplant, and now we moved back to El Paso to be closer to our family. And it's been it's a little bit difficult because El Paso, they don't have lung transplant center. They have kidney. They do kidneys here, but that's it. And so I get all the testing that I need here, no problem. I get all the blood work every 3 months. And then I go back to Houston twice a year for my appointment. And I was just there last week. And I mean, it's good if I think it'd be better if I had moved earlier on because it's kind of like when you're in the hospital. Um, Once you hit your year mark, the team is not going to follow you as closely. Like
Yeah.
it's really frustrating actually because they kind of just and it's not just me. I've heard this from several people. Like after you hit your year, then it's not that they don't care about you anymore, but they don't focus on you as much as they do
Well,
in the first
yeah,
year.
and they're busy with the next batch who are
Right.
coming through. Yeah.
And so it's hard because I still get what I need. I get what I need through my coordinator, um, and then I have to travel twice a year. And this last time I went, I was a little bit frustrated because I did all of my testing in El Paso. I got the PFTs, the CT scan, the echo scan, the bone density scan, all the blood work. And then I fly to Houston, spend all this money, and I see my doctors in the office for 10 minutes, and then that's it. They don't do anything. And so I'm like, why did I come all the way over here for this? We could have just had this conversation on the phone, but they don't do that. They want to see you. So it's challenging. But I'm going to do it because I want to live in El Paso. But if they had a transplant center in El Paso, I would for sure switch over.
So our motivation for moving is my adult son has some serious pancreatic disease and has reached a stage in his disease progress that he needs some very advanced care. And on the strength of that, there's a limited number of places around the country that can provide that to him. And so we are moving to Rochester, Minnesota, or that vicinity, so that he can receive care from Mayo Clinic. And the fortunate thing for me is Mayo Clinic also has a significant transplant program, including lung transplant.
Yeah.
So it was actually, once we started trying to evaluate what we needed to do to facilitate his care, it became a no-brainer, because clearly for me, you wouldn't want to be cared by Mayo Clinic.
Right.
And so I think from that perspective, it was a pretty easy decision from a healthcare perspective to make that change. Clearly weather and lifestyle wise, a little different to Tennessee, but that's okay, because there's also some fantastic things to do there. And we've been professional gypsies for most of our adult life, my wife and I. We moved all around the UK, then we obviously became expats and sort of immigrated here to the US, and initially settled in Philadelphia. Then after 6 years, moved down here to the Nashville area. So, moving to southeast Minnesota just becomes the next logical step. It's fun.
Well, that's great. Some people love that. Some people love to change it up. My husband's like that. Not so much, it's a pain, but I don't mind it. So I have a new life. So I'm just going to live it the best I can. So
absolutely.
Yes.
And that's kind of, I think it's kind of interesting, to coming back to talking about providers for a second. They are a little schizophrenic, because on the one hand, they want to be cautious. And like we were saying earlier on, you always get the worst case scenario of the spreadsheet first.
Yeah.
Because they're always trying to hedge their bets and make sure you're not disappointed. You understand how serious it is. So and clearly the number of years I've worked with doctors in particular, I know the drill. I know the talk track. But they then get schizophrenic and go, but we want you to live your best life.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of sort of what I feel I need to keep reminding them is, hang on a second, you said I could go live my best life. That's why you gave me these new lungs.
Yeah.
So don't keep putting these constraints around me. And on from there, the logical, sensible ones I get, avoiding infection by watching what we eat, what we expose ourselves to, masking, particularly this time of year. I'm still, clearly, because I'm still inside a year, I mask into every grocery store I go into.
Yeah.
Right. Go to the airport, I mask before I get out of the car.
Yeah.
Before I even sort of set foot on the sidewalk, never mind inside the terminal building, never mind inside an airplane. Thank goodness for us, COVID trained us incredibly well for the last 2.5 years what to do to control your environment and try and protect yourself as much as you can. So I continue to do all of that. But as I move forward to other aspects of my life, before I became acutely ill, I had learned to love woodworking. Now, woodworking is a very dusty process.
Yes.
Right? Not particularly sort of conducive to, a post-lung transplant individual and how we move forward from there. But I started researching now, how can I continue woodworking and be protected. And I'm looking at all of the dust control and sort of exposure management processes. So, for example, I bought a positive air respirator, like the hooded style that they wear in hospital, because I knew that technology existed that gives you that positive airflow
Yeah.
to be able to give you highly filtered air. So I'm looking at using that as part of being able to continue my hobby. I'm looking at other things, and as I've started studying the technologies for capturing dust as you're working with wood, looking at all of those technologies. And interestingly enough, I'm interested in starting a YouTube channel talking about that from a vulnerable person perspective, because there are a lot of people, particularly as they get older, enjoy woodworking and may have enjoyed it for decades, suddenly develop some respiratory illness and feel that they are told they have to give it up. So I'm very interested in using my knowledge and learning more about how to try and be able to use those insights to be able to safely continue to do some of those things.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. Yeah.
We gotta live our life. They didn't give us this to sit in a bubble, because if we did, then that's when you get into the mindset of my friend's brother saying, well, I don't think I want a lung transplant because it comes with all these consequences. Well, we those of us who are going through the transplant experience know you have to adapt. You have to
Yeah.
learn to live with this. And I love David Erasmus saying, we've traded you one really bad disease for one very manageable disease.
Yeah.
So let's help you manage it so that you can live your life to your best extent.
That's true. I mean, I think any transplant, it's not really all the things you have to change aren't really hard things you have to change. They're just minor things that you have to update and do a little bit differently. So it's not that difficult. In fact, it's easier managing all those new things than it was just living before transplant. It was hard. It's hard to breathe. It was hard to do anything. And now I could do anything I want. I just have to take a little bit extra precaution. So anyway, well, I think that's great. And I bummed out that you're going to have to be homeless for Christmas. When we moved, we were living in Airbnbs for the first few months because we were trying to buy a house. We didn't know it was going to take so long. And it was a struggle moving every month to a new Airbnb. But now we have our house and we're happy. And so I hope that you find a house quickly and that you aren't homeless for too long.
Well, we're fortunate in that my wife and I went up for a visit to Southeast Minnesota, and we toured about 20 homes, usual thing you do when you first trying to explore an area, and huge distance, 50 square miles or something like that, looking at different towns and things like that. And funnily enough, the number one home we saw then, we said, wow, if this home was still available, we love this home. It spoke to us. If you in terms of emotionally and logically, it spoke to us in terms of what we were looking for. And it's in a town that we like the look of. And well, it had an offer on it, but that offer was contingent. And now that we've got a buyer for our place, we put an offer in and said, here's a non-contingent offer. And they've accepted it. So
well, that's fantastic.
we've got a home inspection happening on that, and hopefully.
Oh yeah, you guys
weeks of homelessness, and then maybe something will play out.
Well, that's great. I'm very happy for you. So I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I do have one more question for you. And I want to ask you if you have a piece of advice that you wish that you had before your transplant that you could give to somebody who's pre-transplant. What would you say?
Probably the two things that we started on. Statistics can scare you. So get some perspective on the statistics. If it's a long time since you did your basic statistics class, either in high school or college, understand that that average that you see of the 5 years out there is just a number. It's
Yeah.
just a number. Your path and your story will be very, very different from that number. And so from that perspective, I would say that's one thing, because clearly I didn't know that number existed before I was told I was having a transplant. I'd never contemplated it.
Mhm.
And I think that once it landed, it was like, okay, is that it? Is that the least I'm getting?
Yeah.
If I enter into this? And I think, could try and get past that really quickly. And then secondly, positive mental attitude. Approach everything as a challenge to be overcome. And, I one of my favorite country songs, if you're going through hell, keep on going. You just got to keep on going,
Yeah.
because it's too easy to succumb and say, oh, this isn't going to work out. Oh, woe is me. Oh, no. Find the people around you who can encourage you, that you can take strength from, and just go for it. Drive. Try and do more. Particularly during rehab, do more. Just keep doing more.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I just wanted to tell you that I'm grateful that you came on to tell your story, and I'm so happy that you're doing so well. 7 months out, you look great, and I wish you the best and good luck in your move, and keep going.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jenny. And I'll also keep on listening.
Great. Yeah.
And tag me for a year's time to do that, because I know you do follow-ups. Tag me for a follow-up in a year's time.
Absolutely. I'd love to have you come back on in a year or so. So I will reach out to you, or you reach out to me, whichever first.
You got it.
Okay. All right. Well, Stuart, have a great day.
Thanks, Jenny. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you for listening to the Pre to Post Transplant Podcast. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Facebook. Oh, and if you have not signed up to be an organ donor, please visit www.organdonor.gov and register today. You too can save lives.